Okay.
Okay, David, we can start when you're ready.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is David Patterson. I'm a senior research fellow with the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, ISGAP. I'd like to welcome all of you to yet another installment in our seminar series on the historical tropes in contemporary anti-Semitism. The series brings out the perennial patterns in the phenomenon of anti-Semitism to shed light on the matter of why exactly it is the longest hatred. So the aim of the series is, number one, to elucidate the millennial themes and the variations on those themes that bring out the essence of anti-Semitism. Secondly, to expose and explain why the phenomenon is at once ancient and modern. Third, to impart a deeper understanding of how what was once the scandal of anti-Semitism morphs into a fashionable anti-Semitism. And finally, to enable participants in the seminar to recognize the phenomenon in all of its subtle manifestations and to seek ways of responding to it. Themes to be examined include the anti-Semitic appropriation of the truth, the blood libel, blood purity, issues of purity, the drive for redemption, salvation, the ways in which the Jews are turned into an invisible and ubiquitous evil, and other aspects of the phenomenon. The seminar series brings out the implications of theological and ideological tropes of anti-Semitism, both historical and contemporary. In the end, the series will situate contemporary anti-Semitism within the eternal context of ethical demands and imperatives. It will pose the ethical questions that implicate each of us who encounters the phenomenon, the questions put to the firstborn of the first human: where's your brother and what have you done? So today's seminar is presented by Dr. Terin Tehan. Dr. Tehan specializes in Holocaust studies and digital rhetoric with a background in literature that embraces multidisciplinary approaches. She earned her PhD in humanities from the University of Texas at Dallas in 2021, where incidentally I had the great honor of working with her as her advisor. Her dissertation focused on the emerging media of video games and how the Holocaust is referenced and depicted within those games. Her current research furthers this by exploring how digital narratives and game design mechanics incorporate anti-Semitic stereotypes and other problematic tropes. She combines her research interests with instructional experience ranging from grade school to post-secondary classrooms. And in her teaching, she especially strives to connect with STEM and non-traditional students, sparking appreciation for the study of history and literature in an increasingly fast-paced world. So please join me to welcome Dr. Tehan this morning, and it's all yours, Terin.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Patterson. I appreciate it. Let me make sure the technology is working here. I should be able to share my screen with you all. All right, does everyone see my first slide?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you so much. All right, well, good morning, everyone. I'm here to talk about anti-Semitic tropes as they appear in the emerging medium of video games. Video games are an emerging medium for new generations, but like all media, they have subtle effects on their audiences. For many players, video games spark interest in history and politics, yet games can also repackage old hatreds in new ways. This presentation explores manifestations of anti-Semitism found in video games, ranging from problematic Jewish-coded characters to simplistic representations of the Holocaust. Jewish figures in games are often portrayed negatively. Some incorporate the same stereotypes found in traditional media, while others are framed solely as passive victims without agency, as in many World War II era strategy and shooter games. Video games tend to portray Jews in one of three problematic ways. The first embraces negative stereotypes of Jews found in traditional media. The second approach presents Jews as passive victims to be rescued, usually by non-Jewish allied military protagonists in a storyline reinforcing heroic narratives of World War II. And the third approach portrays Jews as somewhat of a model minority, where Jewish characters tend to be diligent and well-educated, though still lacking agency to affect a game's plot and relegated to secondary supportive roles. Jewish characters analyzed may be outright stated to be Jewish in the game or outside it, such as in interviews with the game's writers and developers. But they can also be heavily implied to be Jewish to the point where the majority of the player base accepts this to be part of the game's storyline. Today, I'll give an overview of some relevant video game genres and concepts alongside specific examples of anti-Semitic game content. My hope with this rather brief overview is that game developers, players, and policymakers will understand that it is crucial to educate students in media literacy and how to critically interpret interactive digital media narratives, the rules and procedures programmed into every game, and the way players perceive and act on this information. I'll end with some small recommendations for both video game players and developers on how to recognize and reduce the impact of anti-Semitic game content. First, I'll have a very quick look at how video games function as persuasive texts. I use a lot of Ian Bogo's theories of procedural rhetoric, which studies the idea that video games create meaning not only through text, imagery, music, and sound, but also through processes inside a game, like the rules of the game, how you win the game, various ways that algorithms work within the game. So it's important to look at a couple aspects of video games when we're trying to find problematic representations. There are a couple of different kinds of narratives in game, and the main ones are embedded narratives, which are the pre-programmed narratives, the script of the game, objects you can interact with in the game world, things of that nature. That's embedded. It's pre-existing before someone even touches a game. And then the emergent narratives come out in the interaction of the players and the game. This can come out in player communities, things like that. And you can find anti-Semitic content in both of these types of narratives. Another important concept is that of studying games as systems of rules rather than narratives. There's a little bit of two ways to look at this, and I think somewhat of the truth lies in both. And that approach is called ludology. So another useful thing to think about with games is this MDA model, which divides games into three main aspects. You have the mechanics of the game, which are the processes and actions allowed and encouraged by a game. And these are designed and programmed. It's the way the player character gains or loses health, strength, and abilities, how death is handled in the game world, how the player character learns, and whether or not there are limits to this knowledge. So that's mechanics. The next part is dynamics, which is how the game is actually played in real time. So it's players interacting with the mechanics, often in ways that the game's designers don't fully intend. And then the last thing to think about is aesthetics, which is the player experience and the sense of fun evoked by a game. So it might include character appearance, level design, music, art, things like that. Each aspect brings up questions relevant to the study of game-based anti-Semitism. Some of these questions might be, are Jews portrayed as mere victims rescued by another party? Are they portrayed as individuals or as a collective? Are they given heroic traits in a story or agency to affect a narrative's plot? These questions tie in with mechanics and aesthetics. And then some questions of dynamics are, how might anti-Semitism manifest and proliferate in player communities? And this happens a lot in player communities. One example would be massively multiplayer online games that have, often thousands of players inside a server-generated world concurrently. And one way people express themselves is by giving themselves very offensive names. And so one way to guard against this use of game dynamics is to have basically representatives of the game company, often called GMs for game masters, to monitor, people's use of game mechanics. And in the case of offensive names, force the player to change it. Things like that. There also is some research being done about how games are used, like both the voice platform in-game and then the text-based communication platforms are often used as part of recruitment for extremist ideologies. I think there was actually something from a United Nations Counterterrorism Commission about this actually a month ago. So I know there's a lot of current research on that. But back to anti-Semitism and how it manifests in games, it's useful to know that there are a couple of different types of games with their own rules and appeals. The ones we'll be talking about are more action games, which include first-person shooters, and they involve practice coordination and quick reaction times, and often competition against other players. Simulation and strategy games, they simulate something. They allow players to enact strategies, prioritizing various variables in the game world. But that is not mentioned as much as RPGs, which are role-playing games. And that is where you find the most complex narratives and stories inside a video game. A player takes on the role of at least one character, which through the course of the game develops new skills and talents, which the player often chooses. So I have found that Jews are often referenced in World War II era action games and alluded to often in role-playing games. Other things to note are single-player games are designed to be played by one person alone. And then multiplayer games, they can involve anywhere from 2 to thousands of players all interacting. Another thing we need to think about is whether or not a game has sandbox elements, which allows players to construct and create additions to the game world, often used to express offensive views. Not always, but it happens a lot. This is an example from a Anti-Defamation League report 2019 of player-created anti-Semitic content in Fortnite. As soon as this one player zones into the game server, they see a constructed swastika. So that's just an example of the kind of things that happen. I'm not going to talk very much about modded games, but there is a way for independent programmers to add elements to a game without the developer's knowledge or approval, and then package these and disseminate these in their own ways. And I think you can see how this would be used for nefarious purposes. All right, we'll start. The first problematic portrayal of Jews in video games is the trope of Jews as villains. Now, this manifests in two main ways. The first way is through underground extremist propaganda video games designed to deliberately convey anti-Semitic messages. Some examples, KZ Manager Millennium, that's been around since about 1990. It keeps recreating itself. And it's a very controversial simulation game produced by, I'm assuming, European neo-Nazis. The player runs a concentration camp. Sometimes they use the names of historical concentration camps. Sometimes the victims are Jews, sometimes they're Turkish immigrants to Germany. It kind of depends. Another example here, the bottom right, is from a game called Ethnic Cleansing. It's a first-person shooter where the player character guns down people from a variety of minority groups, culminating in the final boss, the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon. So this is kind of self-explanatory. It's not the main focus of my work. We also have a second type of villainous portrayal, which is not designed, the whole game was not designed to spread extremist propaganda, but it nevertheless reproduces anti-Semitic stereotypes. An example of this would be this villain from Grand Theft Auto 4 on the lower left, Isaac Roth. He is depicted with a very Hasidic appearance. He's a diamond broker and a leader of an organized crime syndicate called the Jewish Mob. That is actually the name that is used in the game. And despite the fact that the player character is also a criminal, like the player character is sent to kill them after a crime deal gone wrong. So this is just an example of the kind of characters that tend to recur in some things. This is a pretty egregious example, and especially egregious because it's been going on since the launch of World of Warcraft in 2004. This is a particularly interesting game because it's existed continuously for almost 20 years. And that's a time frame that gives it a more complex narrative that goes beyond games to books and even a tie-in film. So this game is set in a violent neo-medieval world populated by elves, zombies, werewolves, all sorts of, vague creatures. One of these races is goblins. And the physical traits, as you can see, resemble caricature. We have some of the hairstyles resemble caricature. The oversized nose resembles caricature. The accent that they use in the game is reminiscent of Brooklyn, New York. And as a race in the game, they have a big association with fields like banking, mercantile, finance, and a lot of tech fields. So when these things all pile up, it seems less and less like an accident. Just another example, they usually run the game's auction house, which is where players can trade with each other. And so in order for players to trade with each other, they have to interact by clicking on various non-player goblin characters. And the auction house, the game server takes a cut of each transaction. So this game mechanic, this is an example of a really bad game mechanic because it essentially recreates conspiracy theories about world finance. Move on a little bit. No one in the game, because the game is a neo-medieval world, no one actually came out and said, this is an anti-Semitic caricature, but plenty of players recognize this. In a survey done in 2016, 26% recognized that there were anti-Semitic overtones to the way this race in the game is portrayed. And those are just the people who admitted it. We'll go on a little further. I mean, we see this kind of thing over and over. I mean, Harry Potter came under some attention for having something similar with their portrayal. And this is just something that happens. It happened in older media, and now it's happening in video games, where there's a reproduction of old stereotypes. And sometimes these stereotypes are further removed from the original anti-Semitic source. Arguably, the developers, writers of World of Warcraft and Harry Potter, both the films and the book, we're probably looking more towards Tolkien, who gets his views on what goblins are from European folklore, which then has the anti-Semitic problematic overtones in there. So it's something that people notice. While the intent is to reference older literary works, the effect is anti-Semitic imagery. Fans of these games and players notice these things. I have a quote here from one of the more well-known content creators involved in World of Warcraft. He's a streamer, and as recently as last month, he's trying to get other players to recognize this. He said, "I said this a long time ago. Goblins are clearly caricatures of Jewish people. There are a lot of similarities." And there are plenty of people in the gaming community who do recognize this. So this is an old example, since players have been talking about this problem since WoW's release in 2004. However, it's a recurring problem. New game content and tie-in material also maintains this, such as a Warcraft book published in December 2021. And in a review for a World of Warcraft fan site, someone writes, very measured prose. "Another major criticism has been about the portrayal of the goblins as a race with their large hook noses and greed. Goblins already can be guilty of sometimes reinforcing Nazi-era styled anti-Semitic stereotypes. While this doesn't necessarily make goblins in World of Warcraft inherently anti-Semitic, it does mean that their handling should be sensitive to this issue, which is why it's so concerning that," and they give the name of the tie-in book, "Exploring Azeroth, Kalimdor," which is why it's so concerning that this book includes a mention of goblins poisoning the waters. Well poisoning is a well-known anti-Semitic stereotype, and to their credit, the author of this review has a lot of links to articles about things like blood libel, and it seems, gamers educating other gamers, which is, it's an encouraging thing to see that a lot of players are tired of seeing these stereotypes. So that was a brief view of two different ways in which Jews are portrayed as villainous archetypes in video games. Another manifestation of anti-Semitism in video games is the trope of Jews as victims. Now, this often centers around the Holocaust, but this is a relatively new development in gaming because video games traditionally sidestepped mention of the Holocaust while just focusing on World War II. This scene that you see in the back, it's taken from a 2017 game called Call of Duty World War II, part of that very long-running franchise. And it was the first one to actually mention, well, closer allude to the Holocaust. It explores Robert Zussman, a Jewish American GI, who's a secondary character in the game, who fights alongside the main character. Here he is shown being freed from a POW camp that was heavily implied to be a concentration camp in the game's trailer. So some trademarks of Jews as victims, which Zussman exemplifies in many ways, are limited agency to affect change in the game's plot and flat static characterization. The characters aren't very complex and they don't really change in the course of the work. So Zussman is a prime example of this. He's always being rescued in the game a couple times. He's shown as smaller on the screen repeatedly. He's often towered over by other GIs. And in the plot of this game, to make the long story short, Zussman is captured, he's sent to a POW camp, but he's separated because he's Jewish. The game implies that he's sent to a concentration camp through a cinematic where he's shown being thrown into a boxcar. He's actually sent to a POW camp, just a very rough one. Now, meanwhile, the game centers on the protagonist, whose nickname is Red, his last name is Daniels, and he's seen, searching, and against all odds, he rescues Zussman mere seconds before he's shot by an SS officer. And so Zussman's story, such as it is very secondary to Red's. Red's development as a character is shown through various cutscenes, which are, like miniature movies inside a game. That's another example of an embedded narrative. And so Red's story is shown through that, shown through flashbacks to the death of his brother, which he blames himself for. And in the end, when Red rescues Zussman, it's portrayed through juxtaposition as a way for him to save his brother again. Only Zussman is his brother. And so basically the sole named Jewish character in this game is a plot device meant to enhance Red's own journey of self-discovery. Now I say that Zussman's the only named Jewish character in this game because there are a few others. It's not just Zussman who is minimized as a figure. While searching for Zussman, Red encounters what he terms cruelty that will stay with me forever, is how he phrases it. And that is said in conjunction with these images on the screen. And these images imply that Red encounters Jewish survivors of concentration camps, but their portrayal is even more problematic than Zussman's. They're literally nameless victims. They have no dialogue in the game. It's implied that Red speaks to them, but he doesn't say about what. And their stories aren't told at all. Instead, their suffering is a backdrop to build suspense in Red's search for Zussman. So that's a particularly sobering look. Call of Duty, this is just one of many games in that franchise, and it's helped shape an entire subgenre of World War II era shooter games. To put the game's popularity into other terms, approximately 6.5 million people play a Call of Duty game online per day. Now, the game's perspective of World War II is very redemptive. It leans towards hope while avoiding tragic details. And Holocaust atrocities are simply labeled cruelty, and the presentation of Zussman, basically all Jews, is that of a victim to be rescued by the all-American player character. The game incorporates elements of the American mythology of World War II as a good war, refers to older media like Saving Private Ryan, which you can see, they actually recreate the Band of Brothers title page here, in showing these two GIs helping Zussman to his feet. So there's a lot of recreation reference to older media in this. So even if these games inspire players to study the history, as many players of Call of Duty do report doing, they precondition players into reading history a certain way as part of this good war narrative where the Holocaust and Jews are diminished. Lastly, last problematic trope of Jewish characters in video games is the idea of a Jewish character as a sidekick, as this one also kind of straddles the line with this. Now, this seems more benign than the other presentations, but it's also very frustrating and problematic. The Jewish characters in this mode can be more rounded, more complex, and they can even have some limited agency to the point where they might rescue the main character once, maybe twice. But they aren't focal players. The player never enters, their perspective. They are not player characters. They're just sidekicks. One common form is kind of this archetypal doctor or scientist figure, and I have two examples. I have Dr. Emmerich from Metal Gear Solid in 1998, if you can't tell from the graphics on the bottom right, and Dr. Isaac Kleiner, who's a scientist in the Half-Life action game franchise. As you can see, at the bottom right, Dr. Emmerich is actually hiding in a supply locker from monsters that the player character saves him from. I'll talk briefly about Zussman again really fast, because he straddles the line of victim and sidekick. And I say this because the writers of Call of Duty World War II clearly wanted players to like him. The game design encourages this in several ways. Zussman gets a lot of screen time from the beginning, where he is joking and even gives Red a pep talk before the landing at Normandy. He also helps the player character by healing them and shows compassion to civilians, even German children found on one mission. The game's narrative highlights instances of injustice where Zussman as a Jew is othered by his squad mates. Various jokes and witty banter happen. It's all calculated by the developers to make players like him. So in Zussman, you could say the game represents Jews positively, but he's only one character and his story is repeatedly overshadowed. You can see this overshadowing in the very last scene he appears in the game, where he's shown recovering in the hospital. And this is finally a chance for Zussman to be shown as an equal once again, as the one who fought next to the main character. I mean, they were equals. But instead, the cinematography emphasizes his relative weakness. The camera pans to Red Daniels in third-person perspective. It focuses on his reactions to what Zussman is saying, even as Zussman is trying to talk about what happened to him. As you can see on the left, Red takes up all of the screen vertically, while Zussman has that empty space above his head, which kind of calls attention to the fact that he's smaller. It makes him appear diminished. Another example, a more recent example of a Jew as a sidekick would be Dina in The Last of Us Part 2. Now, it's another first-person, third-person shooter game with a very strong narrative. It's a bit of a blockbuster game. To give a frame of reference, it sold over 4 million copies in 2 days in the summer of 2020. It's set in a post-apocalyptic world of zombies where humanity is barely surviving. And Dina, however, is kind of a source of inspiration for the main character, Ellie. But she's not a main character herself. The writer and co-director Neil Druckmann confirmed that she is Jewish, which is promising. And it's actually, in Dina, we see a very rounded portrayal of someone grappling with her faith. Ellie, the main character, asks if she still prays, and she says sometimes. She holds to her memory and Jewish traditions, even in the game's post-apocalyptic setting. You can see this in one rather touching scene where both characters explore a synagogue for supplies. Now, there's a lot of violence in other settings in the game, but the violence doesn't enter the synagogue, which is nice to see. There's a funny moment where Ellie sees a Jewish calendar for the first time and sees that it says 5,774 and asks if they're in the future. And Dina laughs and says, "Oh no, that's a Hebrew calendar." It's a lighthearted moment in the middle of a very dark setting. And this is an example of effective quest mechanics and design. The synagogue, it's part of the game's main storyline, so players all have an opportunity to engage with it. There's no way they can avoid it, and they can put into it what they want to. some players might speed through this section, others might explore it. And there are many clickable objects here. But even so, even with some of these promising representations, there still are these sidekick elements. Like Zussman, Dina is physically smaller than the non-Jewish main character and often shown looking up at her. Her agency is limited. You never play as her. And she basically serves as a way to inspire the main character. And when Ellie, the main character, goes too far in her quest for vengeance, Dina leaves. And this is kind of her most striking trait, because it does give her some agency. She can choose to accept her role as a sidekick or not. And Zussman doesn't get this choice in Call of Duty. However, once this choice is made, Dina's gone. So she's not a focal character. She disappears. Now, as one last bit of evidence for this, the voice actress for Dina, Shannon Woodward, was nominated at the 17th British Academy Games Awards for the category of Best Performer in a Supporting Role. So it's basically says another example of a Jew as a sidekick. Now, there are some difficulties inherent to video games as a medium whenever we're trying to analyze them. One difficulty would be the idea that there are many authors. Video games are largely like films in this respect. There are various specialists in art design, programming, testing, and so on. Developing a complete video game usually takes between 20 and 100 people around 2 or 3 years. And so the time and specialists required makes this a very expensive undertaking. This also makes the issue of anti-Semitic or biased imagery in games more complicated, since all of these people must be aware of and agree on what content to avoid. Another difficulty is that while gaming is rapidly becoming more mainstream, it remains a subculture with some barriers to entry. There's a lot of specialized terminology, and I'm not going to go over all of these words. These are just examples. And there's a bit of an equipment cost. You need to buy an expensive game console or an even more expensive PC that has the specifications required to run a video game, but it's becoming more mainstream. One example of various alt-right communities are co-opting some of the language of gaming, and an example of this would be the term non-player character, which is a computer-generated character whose actions are pre-programmed into the game's narrative. Alt-right commentators like to call their political opponents NPCs, basically implying that they have no capacity for intelligent thought or independent agency. And when you think about it, it is a very, very dehumanizing term. Another consideration to make is the idea of video game realism. There's a lot of optimism about the potential for video game interactivity and immersion as a way to affect audiences in ways that other media cannot, but it's important to consider the nature of realism in video games. The realism in games like Call of Duty is superficial and simplified. While the game includes real weapons and shows historical battles, it often lacks historical context and psychological fidelity. This is a model by Johan Breuer and Ruth Frestel from a 2011 game design conference, but I like it because it shows all the different facets of video game realism. Basically, players can accept that a game is realistic if enough of these facets are satisfied. So if the game has really good representation of physics on screen, like physics and ballistics or the different types of weapons that are used, and it kind of allows other things to sneak into a player's consciousness as something that is realistic. Players can be led to accept other aspects of video game realism, such as unrealistic behaviors and consequences, or stereotypes, when they accept, that some of the aspects might be realistic. I'll show a quick example of appeals to realism. We have, the firearms use the fact that ammo is finite. It kind of heightens the player suspense. There's a muddy trench. The color palette kind of resembles World War II era movies or movies about World War II. So that strikes a chord with players. Another appeal to realism often seen in games is something like this Call of Duty World War II loading screen, which is often the first thing you see upon starting the game. And it replicates older media like newsreel footage. It has the same grainy resolution, low frame rate, and flickering distortion found in old films. And so this is just an example of how video games can heighten a sense of player immersion by making them feel like they're back in time, but it's problematic. I'm going to wrap up with some very brief recommendations for a variety of individuals. Basically, if I could make any recommendations to game developers and writers, it's mostly twofold. One would be maintain active oversight of player communities. Be watchful of in-game voice chat and text chat. Respond quickly whenever other players report someone for offensive content, because usually it's somebody with a terrible name in-game or something of that nature. Establish effective terms of service agreements and enforce them. And then the other thing is more for writers, which is avoid stereotypes of real world cultures. There's plenty of examples that I did not include, and not just, anti-Semitic ones, but racist ones, biased ones, all sorts. There are very powerful ways to talk about themes of persecution without actually recreating a real world minority group in the context of a game world. But so it could be its own slideshow. Other recommendations, for educators or parents, I think it's crucial to enhance media literacy. We can ask ourselves questions like, does the story focus on tragedy? Does the story with Jews focus on tragedy, or is there a redemptive ending of some kind? How are Jewish figures represented? Are they collectivized? Are they made exotic? Are they all victims? There's so many important questions. Do the mechanics and dynamics of video games encourage certain ways of looking at the world? Essentially, as video games reference and reproduce older texts, mixing them to create new texts, it becomes a struggle to discern each individual aspect's source, where history ends and fantasy begins. And so players increasingly look to cinema and even older video games as authoritative representations of past wars and atrocities. So this is just another reason why we really need to be teaching more digital media literacy. Another thing to keep in mind is that games are really good at tangential learning. They spark interest in a subject, but they don't really convey the nuances and complexity of historical events. And they also precondition students to study history a certain way, expecting a focus on battles or extraordinary individuals like those found in history-themed video games. And another thing to keep in mind is the idea that players can perceive things that we might not expect. They can often tell something is off about the historiography of a video game, but they may enjoy the game anyway. And games can be uplifting stories of heroism and empower students to see themselves as a hero, a scientist, or a visionary. It's good to ask why players like a particular game and use this as a way to teach them about why designers make the choices they do. So that's just my encouragement on that note. The last slide. Recommendations, if I could say anything to the gaming community, would be engage critically with the games that you play. Ask yourself why certain aesthetic choices are made, why things are more realistic than others. Be aware that some parts of games are simply calculated to look like things that we will interpret as realistic rather than things that are realistic. One strength of gaming is the ability to build communities of people all over the world or enhance the ones that someone already has with people that they know but are currently far away from. And so there are many ways for younger gamers to build connections they might not be able to otherwise. So if I had to make another recommendation, it would be watch over your community. Older gamers tend to know how to curate their gaming communities, but younger ones more easily fall into groups where racist or anti-Semitic jokes are tolerated or encouraged. So it's important to maintain, like a positive community for many gamers nowadays. Some conclusions: it's crucial to study digital media like video games, how they function rhetorically, how they might reinforce stereotypes or obfuscate truths about history. and how their developers and players create meaning from these games. This is a timely and significant topic, as manifestations of anti-Semitism become increasingly bolder in the modern world. Education on critical thinking and how to recognize manipulation tends to focus on older mediums like print, photography, or film. I only gave a brief overview of the conventions of video game narratives and how anti-Semitism can be found within these games. So in short, a lot more research needs to be done. But I thank you all for your time, and I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Patterson.
Thank you, Tara. Super interesting. We have a couple of questions, comments here. Joseph Levin comments that the video games representation of Jews is very similar to how Jews are generally portrayed on TV. What do you think? Do you notice any similarity there?
Oh, definitely. And in fact, sometimes you can tell a lot of video games, especially ones like World of Warcraft, they kind of comment on pop culture from year to year. And so you can tell that sometimes there are references to television characters in these games. It's a problem that's shared. That's why I showed the goblins in the Harry Potter movie as an example of kind of the same source as the problem of how goblins are represented in World of Warcraft. So it's a big thing.
So yeah, so that's Joseph was seeing what is actually there, that there is a similarity.
Well, I think we both have seen it. Yeah, it's
yeah. Richard Robertson has a question. In your nuanced review of the development process of these games, did you come across the employment of historians or academics who study the Holocaust as consultants?
I have not seen a reference to an academic that specializes in the Holocaust. I do know Call of Duty in its World War II themed games will often have at least one historian that specializes in World War II, but it's its own area. I've never come across them consulting or reading anything that comes from the academic community of Holocaust testimonies or studies. It's a bit of a gap.
Yes, well, so therefore they rely on preconceptions, misconceptions, stereotypes, it sounds like.
Yes, and they rely on older media. Like they'll have Saving Private Ryan as a representative of what war is actually like, because that seems to be what resonates the most with the player base. So they'll rely on all sorts of preconceived notions.
Yeah, you mentioned, please, those of you who have other questions, please send them into the chat or the Q&A, but I have a couple of questions myself. You talked about educators and parents, and you had some advice for them. Are there older people, adult people who play these games? There must be.
Yes. And that's why that's something I tried to mention in the section about, recommendations for gamers, because I think the older you get, the more you learn how to curate your own community and the less tolerance you have for people behaving badly. But younger gamers, sometimes, they stumble across this hobby through friends or through another hobby like computers, things like that. So they don't really have the same guidance, so that leads them to accept the norms, very problematic norms that are presented to them in a lot of the more open gaming communities.
Well, is this calculated, do you think? Are the game designers trying to make youngsters or even older into anti-Semites?
I don't think it's calculated, but I think it's such a point of negligence at this point that, especially the goblins poisoning the well, that stunned me to read that. It's unconscionable negligence in many cases, but I don't think it's a willful thing. I think they're reproducing archetypes from older media that seems to work, and because they want to make money. You know, a lot of these games, they'll make lots, they'll sell lots of copies. Yeah.
It's about money.
Oh, I think that's a big driving concern in a lot of the larger
Sure.
companies.
But if organizations like Aryan Nations, KKK, Stormfront, the Daily Stormer, Red Watch, they're various very anti-Semitic organizations, and then or jihadist groups. It seems like if this could be a good way to spread propaganda, if that's what I want to do, you know, anti-Israel, anti-Jew.
It's something they're already doing. It's why some of these fringe games with very low production quality, you know, made by a few of them in essentially a basement somewhere, that they're already doing it. It's just they don't have the sheer amount of resources that a established mainstream game company would have. But you know, they up their game, so to speak, all the time, creating more and more complex games that can appeal superficially to players who are just thinking, you know, they're playing a shooting game. But it's not as I focused more on the mainstream games because I saw that as a little bit more insidious because it has such a wider reach.
Yes. Well, would you say, do the games appeal? My impression is, please correct me, but my impression is the games appeal much more to emotions and stimulation than to analytical thinking or reasoning. But you do have to figure things out to play games, right? There's a challenge you face, and you have to have a strategy, and you have to analyze something.
Yes, and some subgenres of games emphasize that more often. But a lot of the games with stories in them do appeal primarily to the emotion. Now it's a strange thing because there's a lot of attention being paid to how these games have reward mechanisms like minor dopamine hits for solving a small puzzle and then, you know, pushing you on to the greater puzzle. There's some very concerning things in the field of neurology about this, about like what are we doing to our brains, basically.
That's interesting. Yeah. So how frequently do you find that winning a game, or is there winning? First of all, can you win the game, or is it designed to just keep you playing from now on?
A lot of the bigger games with the massively multiplayer online games, they're designed to keep you playing, and they'll release new content every so often. But it's a concerning model when you think about it, and that would be the kind of game that a lot of extremists would use as a recruiting ground. And it may not even be in the game itself. It might be, oh, you know, join our Discord chat server or our Twitch stream, and then like their people can be pulled into other communities that are ostensibly based around a shared game, but then have their own very problematic norms that are being espoused.
I see. Well, I wonder, at the risk of sounding too paranoid, I wonder if some movements, whether white supremacists or jihadists or anti-Zionists and so on, I wonder if there are individuals who follow the game culture, who look for ways to tap into, you know, associated areas of propaganda, not necessarily the game itself, but what does playing a game lead you to do or to see or to encounter? And once you start playing games, you'll come across all sorts of things you didn't set out to come across, right? So if I know how to manipulate that, I can, without even designing the game itself, if I know how to manipulate things associated with games, then I could use the games to my own ends, even if the game designer is not up to something no good.
Yes, and I think that's already a big problem. It's something that a lot of people are already doing some research on. I did mention that there was a UN panel on counterterrorism that talked about how games are used as extremist recruiting platforms. I think it's from the past month or so. People are looking at this, and a lot of the attention is tied to these secondary communities that spring up around games. So it might not be primarily taking place in a game chat, but they might take people to another voice server of some kind. And whenever I describe this, it sounds a lot like grooming and really horrible things of that nature and crimes that happen. And if there is a question on that, there is some of that in gaming communities sometimes. It's the kind of thing that game developers, whenever they hear a report of it, like they will ban players, but so there is a lot of reaction, but this is it's a problem in other areas too. It's very destructive. I'm not saying that video games are destructive. I'm just saying there are all these impulses at work that are very problematic, and a lot of more attention needs to be paid attention to them.
Yes. Well, you mentioned, you used the word redemptive as when you were describing some elements of that. And in my own view, I think, and very often anti-Semitism has a redemptive dimension. In other words, I can purify the world, purify myself if I eliminate the contagion of the Jew. Or maybe that, the seeing to the purity of blood, the purity of the race requires the elimination of the Jew, the purity of ideology, purity of the creed, and so on, purity of the soul, limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Do you find that in some of these games that there's a kind of a feel-good moment when I deal with the Jew in the game, or eliminate the Jew, or purify the setting of the Jew? Maybe
Not any of these examples that I've explored per se, because they don't end up, except for the fringe ones. But there is a recurring archetype in games of defeating, an evil with a capital E. And usually it's seen as something that's very unmistakably other, like a demon or a zombie or something that is very much inhuman. And so that impulse can easily be channeled. And then there's another impulse with gamers of all kinds where I think there's that thrill of being the hero. Like the world is disordered, but we put some small aspect of order back into the world. And that is kind of a recurring myth or hero's journey that's enacted by gamers in all sorts of genres. So I think these are impulses that can both be harnessed for really terrible ends, as akin to what you said.
Yeah, I mean, the image of the goblins is very interesting and very reminiscent of images that demonize Jews. The eternal Jew, famous Nazi image, although Nazis didn't actually invent the image. It makes it, nobody's ever seen a Jew that actually looks like that. So you mythologize the goblinism, as you pointed out very, very well, is a mythical kind of figure, in a way invisible and everywhere. Kind of goblins are hiding under rocks and under your bed, and they're invisible and they're everywhere.
You're right. They mythologize these figures that are very problematic, but there's another thing that's being mythologized. Sometimes I didn't talk about this in my presentation, but games, World War II games that, fight where you enact, someone who's fighting the Nazis, basically, they mythologize the figure of the Nazi as well. So then you have, it's not everyday bigotry to worry about. It's this mythic figure. And then there's another mythic figure. And then the player character is the hero in the middle. So I think that's also equally destructive. When you mythologize what evil is, you don't tend to see it in yourself anymore.
Ooh, that's very insightful. When you mythologize what evil is, you don't tend to see it in yourself anymore. Very good. Very important point. Very important point. I think we're coming up to the end of the hour. Any last parting shots, questions, comments? Well, Dr. Tehan, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Very eye-opening, super interesting, as always. And I look forward to seeing you again and to more very engaging discussions with you. Thanks so much. Be safe, be healthy, be well.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson, and thank
Bye
you all.
for now.